Ever since the beginning of 2020, I've been on a mission to beat 100 video games every single year, and immediately after finishing each game, I rank it among every other game I've beaten, not by objective quality or historical importance or anything like that, but based simply on how happy it made me personally. So now that August is over, it's time to look back at the 8 games I completed over the course of the month and tell you where they landed on the rankings and why. So let's go ahead and jump in at number 8 with Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I read somewhere that this spin-off was created to attract more casual Western gamers to JRPGs, but now that I've finished it, I can't help but wonder if it had the opposite effect. I'll agree that it's more approachable, if by approachable you mean so brain-dead easy that it's optional to even pay attention to what you're doing in a fight. There are times when the enemies can kill you, but it mostly boils down to luck, like if they just decide to use their one-shot attack or petrify both party members in a single turn. What, that doesn't sound like fun? What if they put 80 of those fights in huge labyrinthine dungeons that take hours to slog through like you're trying to fight your way out of a bowl of spaghetti? And I realize they're making baby's first RPG here, but why did they have to dumb down the story too? Going from Final Fantasy IV and 5 story to this is like watching Oppenheimer and then following it up with an episode of Sesame Street. I wouldn't call it horrible, but with the journey I'm on playing them in order, it's hard to see Mystic Quest as anything more than a pothole. Up next at number 7, we have Sonic Spinball. I have to admit, so far I don't share the enthusiasm for Sonic that so many superfans do, but Sonic Pinball is such an obvious idea that it has to be good, right? Well, it is a very natural idea for a spin-off, and it mostly does feel like you're playing a fun pinball machine with halfway decent boss fights at the top. My biggest problem with the early Sonic titles is that their levels encourage you to go fast, but then punish you for doing so by slamming you into spikes or hurling you off a cliff. Spinball is the first game in the series that actually rewards you for speeding up by allowing you to access important areas that would otherwise be too high up. But there are some major issues here too. You're zoomed in so close that devising an actual strategy is mostly off the table, and for some reason it looks like a graphical downgrade from its predecessors. It's also easier than ever to die through no fault of your own just because you took a weird bounce off some bumper and right into a pool of lava or down some robot monster's throat. I'm 5 games into the Sonic franchise now and I don't get it yet, but Spinball was at least enjoyable enough to be my second favorite Sonic entry so far. Coming in at number 6 is Balatro. I already knew this roguelike poker game was universally adored because that's how it came to my attention, and while it's undeniably well made, it's a little too random for me. Let's start here. A poker roguelike is such an obviously natural idea, I can't believe it hasn't been done, and the flawless execution on that premise from a one-man developer is mind-blowing. Balatro is a true roguelike, meaning that aside from a bunch of new cards you can unlock for future playthroughs, you really do start over from nothing every new run. Now, I personally prefer the roguelite experience because I like the feeling of gradually getting stronger over time, and it's also a little less luck-based since you have some say in your overarching build. But this is very, very luck-based. All that matters is what you pick up on that specific run, and you can't even lean on combat skills or turn-based strategy here. You literally just have to play the hand you're dealt. So even more than most roguelikes, I struggled to get through until I just happened to stumble into a totally broken build and some good hands that coasted me all the way through the second half. Balatro feels like 95% luck, but don't get me wrong, that's not bad. It's just not why I play video games. Does that make sense? Just cracking the top 5 is Gears of War 4. I love this series, and I especially adore the original, but I never felt like any of the sequels were able to really recapture the magic of the first one until now. Gears 1 was special because it wasn't just action, it had tension and atmosphere, and even leaned a little into horror from time to time, but every Gears game since has been just balls-to-the-wall craziness. That isn't necessarily bad, but the pacing was exhausting and a little bit vanilla. Now finally this 4th entry has regained some of that subtlety and restraint that helped to make the series so amazing. There's plenty of action, and some of the set pieces are wild, but in between there are moments of ominous silence, environments oozing with tension, and a couple straight-up horror moments. The plot's always been just kinda meh for me personally, but the jumping graphical performance and sound design further heightens the tone and really makes some of the storytelling memorable. My only true complaint is the cover system. Even in this newer installment, the game never understands when you want to run and when you want to hide because it's the same freaking button. But that's a very minor nitpick, and overall I was so impressed that I almost liked this 4th entry as much as the first game, but not quite. Moving on to number 4, it's Life is Strange 2. I loved the first Life is Strange, but I thought the spin-off Before the Storm was a step backwards. This second mainline entry is almost right back up to peak quality. The initial game had some hills and valleys that were bookended by an awesome beginning and ending. This new story starts out with a literal bang and never really falters from there. Every episode is life or death, and the character animations and performances are so on point that it's impossible not to be invested. In fact, if you just look at the story here, I'd say it's even better than the first one, but that's kind of the problem. It really isn't anything but story. Most choice-driven narrative games games go in all kinds of wild directions based on your choices, but the Life is Strange series just doesn't do that. Your sense of agency is mostly an illusion because regardless of the choices you make, the story stays almost entirely on the same rails. Plus, since your powers are very different here, there's no video gamey rewind mechanic to mix things up, so really you're just in for a ton of cutscenes. That probably sounds bad, but the story's so good that I still really love this game. Is it as good as the original? Nah. Heading into the top 3 now, we've got Mafia Definitive Edition. I'm not sure what I was expecting going into this remaster, maybe something like GTA, but what I got was something way different and in my opinion way better than that. Some of the footage might look GTA-like, but all the fat's been cut away. This is a tightly structured, linear cinematic experience with nothing but great story interspersed with great gameplay. This might sound crazy, but you know what it actually reminded me of more than anything else? Mass Effect. There's no relationship management or RPG elements, but there is an awesome cast of characters with great acting, writing, and directing, and then in between you get to have fun driving around and shooting people. I usually don't go that crazy over story, but this one was so good I couldn't help but be invested. I kept guessing what the plot twists would be, and every time I would be wrong, and I loved every minute of it. I am really glad I played the Definitive Edition. I'm a bit of a baby for modern gameplay, and the outdated graphics, VA, and controls probably would have been a distraction. But I can't think of a single complaint for this version. The only reason it didn't rank higher is just because there are other genres and combat systems that I personally happen to enjoy even more than a great story. Falling just short of the top spot is Deathbound. The competition for Best Souls-like of 2024 hasn't exactly been crowded, but this brand new indie title has made that conversation a lot more interesting. This game is very much a true Souls-like, and most of the basics of the genre like level design, character progression, boss fights, etc. are pretty B-tier honestly, like average to good. Medieval-looking characters and lore against a modern cityscape backdrop isn't new, but the story slowly revealing how you've come to be 8 people at once in this post-apocalypse does get a little crazy. The gimmick here is that it's a party-based Souls-like, which basically means you're playing as your choice of 4 very different classes all at once, swapping between them on the fly and even mid-combo. This is where the game's at its best, choosing your lineup and then jumping into the fray against really tough enemies while juggling dozens of melee and ranged options is intensely satisfying. However, the combat itself does have some Dark Souls 1 level jank to it. It's very easy to get trapped in corners by enemies, and changing targets often causes your camera to go absolutely wackadoo. I ended up ranking this as my second favorite Souls-like of the year, just under Another Crab's Treasure, and if you're an old school fan of the genre like me, I would classify this as a must-play. And finally, my number 1 favorite game I beat in August is Black Myth Wukong. I've now beaten almost every Souls-like in existence, and while this definitely isn't my favorite, it's way up there. First off, the graphics are probably the best I've ever seen, and while the story is all over the place, the imagery and lore and environments are all totally spellbinding. The combat is extremely polished and somewhat unique, with your skills, mana, and heavy attacks all having their own flavors and rhythms. I bet I fought at least 40 bosses. There were some stinkers, but most were excellent, and a few were transcendent, including a final boss that was my favorite fight of the whole year. But despite what you may have heard, this is not a boss rush. In between are sprawling areas full of tons of enemies, items, and treasures waiting to be found. There were only 2 main problems. First, the state of the game at launch was rough, with repeated stutters and frame drops and even some crashes at the worst times. The second was that I hated the final area. They do a bit of a genre swap in the final act, and I personally found it to be a severe pain in the ass except for that final boss. But even considering these notable drawbacks, I was still so impressed that this ended up being my favorite release of the entire year, except for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Well, that wraps up the month of August, and it brings us to a total of 79 games beaten so far in 2024, and a grand total of 526 since we started doing this all the way back at the beginning of the decade. Remember to please click like if you enjoyed the video, and next month we'll be playing the casting of Frank Stone, Astrobot, Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster, and much, much, much more. So feel free to subscribe if you want to see what takes the top spot in September.